Hello and welcome to my video, where I'm going to show you how to repair a hole in your jeans using weaving and stitching. This is a visible mending technique that you can make as subtle or as loud as you wish. You have the option to choose a thread colour that blends in, use the brightest thread colours you can find, or any option in between. To follow along, you'll need some iron-on fusible web, an iron and ironing board, a ruler, some scissors, some kind of pen or pencil that will temporarily mark your fabrics. I'm using a disappearing fabric pen and a water-soluble pencil, plus a hand sewing needle and thread, an embroidery hoop if you have one, and a small piece of woven fabric. I'm using a scrap of lightweight denim. A lint roller for clearing up stray fibres is also useful. As you can see, the jeans have a fair-sized tear here, and this is what I'm going to be covering. It's best to cut off the frayed edges so that the strands don't get in the way of your weaving later on. So that's the first step. Next, cut out a piece of your woven fabric and a piece of fusible web, both big enough to more than cover the tear in the jeans and the damaged denim surrounding it. Hold these pieces together and cut out a rounded shape that covers the areas needing repair. I then used my fabric pen to draw a line at the same point on both pieces. And this is just so I know how they fit together, since they're not perfectly symmetrical. Now trim down the fusible web by a small amount, just a few millimeters, all the way around, so that it ends up slightly smaller than the woven fabric. In hindsight, I would recommend cutting a hole, just a bit bigger than the hole in the jeans, out of the middle of the web before this step, like I did in another project that you can see here. The reason for that is because when you iron the web, it melts and attaches the fabric together on either side. So you therefore run the risk of attaching both sides of the leg of the jeans together doing it this way. However, in this case, it did all work out totally fine. So it's up to you, but I would recommend erring on the side of caution by cutting a hole in the web first. Then turn your jeans inside out and take everything over to your ironing board. It's now time to attach all of these pieces together. So place the web into position on the tear and place the woven fabric on top, right side down. Make sure the fabric completely covers the web. Then all you need to do is follow the instructions on your pack of fusible web to fix the patch to your clothing. Mine's set to steam press on the wool setting for 10 seconds. Check that it's fully attached, and if it's not, keep pressing with the iron until it is. Then leave it to cool. Next is the sewing step, and before we begin, we need to mark out where we'll be weaving and stitching. The first thing I do is draw 3 parallel lines, one either side of the hole and one in the centre. I then draw more parallel lines above and below the damaged area before turning these lines into a preferably symmetrical shape. Within this shape is where we'll be weaving, and outside of it is where we'll be making simple running stitches. I'm going to be using a Sashiko sewing needle, but other embroidery needles would work as well. The needle just needs to have an eye big enough for your thread and be sharp enough to go through denim. For the thread, I'll be using a white Sashiko thread, but you could instead use a few strands of embroidery floss or even some crochet thread if you prefer. Sashiko is a style of traditional Japanese embroidery that's both decorative and functional, and it's the inspiration for the mending I'm doing today, so that's why I'm using traditional Sashiko materials. To make it a lot easier to sew, I then attached an embroidery hoop around this marked out area. This will keep the fabric taut and flat. To begin, I fold a strand of the thread in half and feed the ends into the eye of the needle. You don't want the strand of thread to be longer than arm's length overall, because then it'll get tangled too easily. Then bring the needle up through the fabric and pull it until there's just a small loop of thread on the inside of the jeans. As you can see, I started at the top of the vertical line on the left. Push the needle back down into the fabric right next to where you just came up and take the needle through the loop of thread on the inside of the jeans. Pull tight and this will secure the start of the thread. We're then going to do running stitch, make a long warp thread over the shape we've drawn out, and then continue with running stitch along this line. To do running stitch, you simply take your needle in and out of the fabric, over and over to form a dashed line of stitches. The aim is to try and space them evenly, and usually you want to make them a consistent length, but in my opinion, imperfection adds to the charm of this project, so I made the stitch length more random. So feed the needle in and out of the fabric, and make sure that you come back up through the fabric once you reach the outline of the central shape. You then take the needle down again on the other side of that shape to create the warp thread, which we'll later use for weaving. Then just continue with running stitch on the other side of the shape. Once you reach the other end, do exactly the same thing in the opposite direction. Keep these lines parallel, using the drawn lines as a guide, and space them about 4 mm apart. With regards to when to stop the running stitches, I aimed to create an oval shape overall, with the lines of running stitch longest in the centre and shortest at the sides. Once you've finished filling that area, it should look something like this. At this point, the stitching is looking good, but the area of warp threads in the centre is a bit too sparse to actually weave with. So now we need to go back and create more warp threads to fill in the gaps. You're just trying to fill the gaps by adding another strand of thread. All you need to do is work your way across the central shape, coming up on one side and going down on the other. If the gap is particularly wide, you might need to add 2 threads. I ended up with about 40 warp threads and 23 vertical lines of running stitch. So approximately I did 1 line of running stitch for every 2 warp threads. Once you get to the end of a strand of thread, push the needle through to the inside. I think the best way to secure the thread is to go under the nearest stitch, take the needle through the loop that forms twice, and tighten to form a knot. Then weave in and out of a couple of other stitches before cutting off the excess thread. You then secure the new thread in the same way as you did at the start. Once all of the vertical stitching is done, it's time to start the horizontal stitching. So come up on one side where you want to begin. Sew running stitches in a straight line. And stop at the outline of the central shape. You then need to weave in and out of the warp threads until you reach the other side of the shape. And I find it easiest to do this using the blunt end of the needle because the point tends to split the threads. Don't worry if you make a mistake and go over or under more than one thread like I've done, it's not a big deal. Once you reach the other end, go down through the outline and continue running stitches to the end. As you can see, my pencil lines have disappeared, so now the stitches act as my guide. Then you repeat the same thing in the opposite direction. Space the lines no more than a few millimeters apart, and again try and keep them parallel. Once you get to the weaving step, make sure to follow the pattern you set with the first thread, but in reverse. So where you previously went over a thread, you now go under it, and vice versa. Every thread you weave in the opposite way to the thread next to it. And you just repeat this all the way across, securing the thread at the end. You should then have something that looks a bit like this. Unlike with the vertical stitching, I didn't then have to go back and fill in any gaps, but feel free to do so if you have too much space between any weft threads. And here is what the reverse side looks like, and you can see that the fabric patch has been very much reinforced by the stitching. And that's it, your woven repair is complete. I personally really like the look of this, and it was fun to make as well. I really hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.